Good morning, and thanks for joining us here on Treasure Coast Solutions. Wednesday mornings from 9 to 10 o'clock, we talk about whatever you want, or whatever I want, or whatever anybody wants. We just talk. We got 1 hour to fill, so we got to do something. But, no, we're here to talk about some of the things that may impact you in the community, things that happen on a local level or on a national level that may impact you on a local level. Some of the issues that you may face or are looking at or maybe dealing with in the future. So we kind of talk about a lot of different types of economic and financial issues. Not a financial planning show, although last week we actually talked about some financial planning issues. So that was unusual.
It's a first for everything.
I know, there's a first for everything. That was one of the big secrets, the new and emerging technology that you all could bet on if you wanted to in the financial arena, and that is your long-term health. That's kind of interesting. We hear a lot about that subject, and for those that missed last week's show, what we were talking about is that people are always looking for something like Bitcoin or or the iPhone or something that they can find as the next emerging issue, so they can buy the company and end up with with this huge home run and on a technology side. But what we were talking about is that really the thing that almost all of us pretty much can bet on, and it's somewhat of a sure thing in general, is that with the changes that are occurring in health in general, and the fact that people are paying more attention to nutrition and health and all of those issues, that there's probably a good chance, again, blanket statement, so not always true, but there's probably a good chance that you're going to individually outlive the life expectancy of the mortality tables that insurance investments are on. So now keep in mind that when you buy life insurance, you're betting that you're going to die sooner than the insurance company thinks. So that's not a good bet. For one thing, because people are living longer than the mortality tables. That's one reason it's not a good bet. The second reason it's not a good bet is you won't be here to collect because you'll be dead. So the side to bet on is the annuity side. On the annuity side, the insurance company is betting that you're going to live less, a shorter period of time than you think. And that's a good thing, because health is causing us to live longer. And second of all, if I'm there, I'm benefiting from it. I'm still alive. So anyway, so we were talking about that as being the big play last week in terms of just bet on your health, whether it is not taking your Social Security till you're 70 and a half, and you can get that 28% increase in benefit as a result. That's a big deal. That's a good thing. Buying an annuity, maybe even a immediate annuity that pays out over your life, because you might, and especially if it's a joint annuity between you and a spouse or something like that, where you're probably between the two of you, probably one of you is going to live longer than estimated. So anyway, those are some things that we talked about. Mike, what were you raising your hand for? It wasn't the finger that I usually get. So
no,
go ahead.
It was a full hand.
It was a full hand this time.
It's kind of off topic, but kind of related, and I'm fascinated by it, and I just wanted to throw it by you. I was reading an article about this new app that you can download for your phones, and it's called Sweatcoin.
Sweatcoin.
Sweatcoin. And what it does is it tracks the number of steps that you take outside using your phone's GPS and whatever the walking step counter thing is. And as you accrue steps outside, you can then redeem them for prizes and products through their website.
Really?
And they're talking about the long-term goal is to create a type of cryptocurrency
For
based,
health?
I guess, based on people's walking.
Huh.
And you would be able to trade it just like you trade Bitcoin and Ripple and all these other ones.
Yeah, I drink Ripple. That's funny because it does bring us back to kind of back to the purpose of the show, and that's a little bit relative to economics and finance and some of the things that You know, the U.S. in particular, and also other countries, you know, we really have gotten to a point where our currency is nothing more than a promise to pay.
That's all it is.
Right. It used to be backed by, in some general respects, originally it used to be backed by gold or silver. Then it was, which was a hard asset. You could liquidate it and get gold or silver. There was gold or silver set aside to back that currency. It was then, and it still is. That's why I say to some degree, it still is backed by reserves. It's backed by assets that are in the Federal Reserve. Although some of those, the majority of those assets are really full faith and credit of the U.S. government, which is a promise to pay. Right. So they call them Treasury bonds or Treasury notes, but in reality, they're nothing more than the government's promise to pay. So, and this is what's happening. Bitcoin. What is Bitcoin?
That's a great question.
It's a promise to pay, right? In effect, it's amazing in that it is. People are trading on Bitcoin, and Bitcoin is it is only as good as if that company goes under. If Bitcoin, the Bitcoin itself could be reliable, but it's only as reliable as, in effect, the company's ability to continue to function. If the company that controls Bitcoin is stealing all of your assets and has no money, it's still basically an investment in a company who's promising to exchange assets, to control transactions, to move money around for you. It's kind of a quasi-bank is what it is. But to a large degree, there's nothing behind the Bitcoin. There's no gold behind the Bitcoin. It's still a speculative asset. In fact, it's more speculative than a regular currency because of the fact that it can move. Regular currency moves around based on the value of the dollar, international trade, the strength of the dollar overseas, things like that. This thing moves around based on people's perceived notion of how much it's going to be used,
or perceived notion of what it costs or what the value is.
Right.
It's worth, I don't know what it is today, but let's say $8,000 per Bitcoin. It's only worth that because everybody collectively goes, oh, all right, I guess it's worth $8,000 today.
Right. That's the thing. So if tomorrow everybody decides, or what if the company that handles the Bitcoin, that control, because somebody's making money off that, that handles that, what if they're gone? What if they're out of business? What if their exchange collapses? What if their ability to track your Bitcoins goes away? What if somebody steals the record of your Bitcoin? What do you have to show that you have a Bitcoin? You've got a record from the company saying what you bought. But if that record is destroyed or goes away or is transferred or changed or altered, what do you have to show? You don't have anything solid. You don't have even a bill. You don't even have something you can say, see, I got this currency, and it's worth it. It says it's worth $1, so you need to give me $1. In effect, it's there are no bearer bonds. There are no bearer currencies. The thing about currency is that the thing that makes it useful is that whoever owns it, it's theirs. Now, that causes a huge security issue because it's not titled in your name. Somebody doesn't say, there's not, at the Federal Reserve, I don't go to the Federal Reserve and they say, Mark, you've got dollar bill number 1000304. They don't have them registered to me. The Bitcoins are registered, which is nice. I know that I own it. But what if that registration changes? What do I have to prove? And what if I can't get to that registration? What if I can't get to those records? So, and that's really what you're talking about with a lot of international currencies. You take any of the South American countries that have had problems with hyperinflation. What's their currency actually worth on any particular day? because the economy behind it is not worth anything. And the dollar, or the equivalent of the dollar over there, the currency in that country, is not worth anything. For example, one of the reasons that the Chinese are successful internationally is because they control a couple things. They control the price of their goods and services in their country, because it's a communistic country, and keep in mind, it is a communistic country. There's nothing capitalistic about China, nothing at all. The businesses are controlled by the Chinese government, or people who the Chinese government directly controls. It is not a free enterprise system. I know that Hong Kong and Singapore used to be. That ain't the case. It is a pretend capitalistic system, because the Chinese really don't want the rest of the world to move out of China. They want to do business. They need to economically do business with the rest of the world. But it is not a capitalistic system. It's a communistic system. The assets are, which means that the assets are all owned by the government, including all of the business assets. Any company in China is owned by China, by the government. And as I've said before, what's the difference between socialism and communism? Somebody might argue, oh, well, the Chinese government is more socialist. Well, it's not. But if that argument is made, if you don't own the assets, but you control their output, which is what socialism is about, controlling the output. If you don't own the asset, but you control anything that's generated from the asset, socialism, they're the same things. I mean, they accomplish the same thing: government control of the assets and revenue that's generated from it. It's interesting from that standpoint that the definition, from an accounting standpoint, the definition now under generally accepted accounting principles of an asset, all right, no longer is based on who has title. It's interesting. The U.S. used to be, from an accounting standpoint, it used to be that it was very important who owned the asset. You didn't put the asset on your balance sheet as you being the owner of it unless you had title to it. That was the idea. But even the accounting profession worldwide, this isn't just in the U.S., this is also international financial reporting standards, they recognize that an asset, and they have recognized it before GAAP did, U.S. did, they've recognized that it's who controls the income from the asset and is benefiting from the income from the asset. So if you're benefiting from the income stream of the asset, then you own that asset. So that's kind of the interesting thing there, is that you really it's in that manner, communism, socialism, the whole thing. It's a question of who controls the revenue stream, who controls the asset. So, but looking at that, when you start looking at assets and revenue streams, it brings you back to this whole concept of currency and what it is. And what I was saying is that the reason the Chinese have been successful is they control the assets that produce income for the country, and they control their currency, and they arbitrarily determine what their currency is worth, and not the free market, not what people think it's worth, like the Bitcoin concept. The Bitcoin concept, Mike's right. With Bitcoin, he's exactly right. It's a question of what the people think. That's what determines value. But the Chinese, they say what the value is. That's how they control. They control the assets. They control the income from the assets. They control what the currency is traded in, so that you actually are truly overvaluing or valuing the assets when they change hands at what you want them changed at internationally. And to do that, they are very, very specific and very, very dedicated to protecting their currency. There is a black market for the renminbi, the renminbi yuan, but it's but the Chinese, make sure that there's not much of that. It's difficult. You can, but it's difficult to get money out of China. You cannot get money, assets. Let's say you make a fortune in China, and theoretically, and this is why I say the Chinese control it. You make a fortune over there, and then you decide to leave China. Well, you're not taking your fortune with you. You better find a way to get that back over here. And there again is why U.S. trade with China is significant from the Chinese individual Chinese standpoint, not from the Chinese government. That's why they want to control it, is because if they lose control of international trade, they actually lose control of their assets and currency because, well, here's an easy thing. Let's say I have the equivalent of $7 million in China, in a Chinese bank in mainland China, that is my dollars, my renminbi. So, and it's worth, let's say, based on China's trade rate, it's worth $7 million. So I can't call up my bank in China and say, could you wire me $7 million to my bank in the U.S.? That ain't happening. They don't allow that. That's not going to take place. Interestingly enough, Mike and I were talking earlier about the fact that that somebody's making money off Bitcoin. That there is somebody who's monitoring and accounting for the Bitcoin system. In China, there is a single government-sponsored monetary exchange. It's actually owned by some. It's controlled, and the profits from it, so to speak, go to someone who's very high up in the communist system over there. The Chinese government actually owns it, and it is the only place you can legitimately exchange Chinese currency for other currency of the world. Yeah, it's the only place you can do that, and legally. And they control how much of it and what happens. But interestingly enough, they get a percentage of every single thing that's done. They take a cut from every single legitimate exchange that they allow, and it's a pretty decent number. I mean, maybe I don't know, maybe I don't remember what the number is. Somebody told me one time. It's the equivalent of pennies or so, but on trillions of dollars that ultimately change hands, because that's going both ways. That's U.S. companies coming in with dollars and converting those to renminbi so that they can operate in China, because they're using the Chinese currency there. So how do people get money out of China? Well, it's very difficult. It's very difficult to get out. But one of the ways you do that, and that's why we see people coming here to the U.S., is I can't wire my $7 million in my example. I can't wire my money out to my U.S. bank, which is what you could do if you're a U.S. citizen. Let's say you're over in Europe and you're in Germany and you decide, hey, I want to get some money out. There's something here I like. You just call your bank and say, hey, wire $7 million to my bank here in Germany. They will then convert it to euros, or in the old days marks or whatever, and then I'll have my money and I'll be able to spend it, and I can buy it, in that currency, and that's pretty seamless. That happens right away. There's current market value on the conversion rates from the dollar to the euro, and it's very easy to make that change. But that's not the way it works in China. So now I'm in China. Now I'm out of China. I got my $7 million in China, and I need to get it because I can't spend it. It's not worth anything. And that's the interesting thing. No matter what you say you've made, no matter what you say you've done, if you can't spend it, then it isn't worth anything. You didn't really make it if you can't spend it. And And that's the interesting thing, and that's why, frankly, that's why I don't understand why our government and other governments, but our government in particular, doesn't tax spending instead of income. Because frankly, I can have income, but if I don't have the cash available to spend, then have I really made any money? No. I mean, unless I have the ability to turn my income into something that benefits me directly, I really haven't made any money yet. It's not until I actually spend the money or give the money to somebody else who's going to spend it that I've actually made any money. So from my standpoint, it never made sense that you're taxed on income, not spending, because spending is what it's all about. If I got my $7 million, I made $7 million in China. That $7 million is worth Zippo if I can't spend it, except in China, and I don't want to be in China. So, and in China, I'm not getting fair money. All I'm doing is getting an allocation of resources that the government says that they want me to buy. So they'll let me pay the price they want to pay with the dollar, with the renminbi that they're going to say is worth a certain amount, so that I buy a certain product. There's no free market in that. What I'm getting is what the government wants me to get at that point in time. That whether that is blue jeans or it's it's steel. It's what they want me to buy at the price they want me to buy it at, and using money that I've made that they've allowed me to make to convert back into what they want me to buy. That's all up. Communism is all about recirculating the dollars, recirculating the pot. It is not, and the only way there's a net increase in that process is if they trade with someone outside the country. So they have to control that trade. If they don't control that trade, it affects directly the assets that are available within their country to make the people within the country think that they, are able to function. It's a really interesting system because it's a pure communistic system buried in quasi-capitalism. But Chinese are smart. They know that you control, there's multiple ways to control assets and output. They ultimately own it and determine what you're going to pay for it based on what they price it at through subsidies or other things, or what they, whether that's a subsidy of the actual product itself, like in steel, they're actually subsidizing their steel industry. They provide incentives to those steel industries in terms of direct subsidies to the companies to hire workers, to pay money, to do everything so that the price is less, so that the Chinese can sell their steel at less prices. So whether it's controlled that way with direct subsidies to the companies, or it's control in terms of saying, okay, the renminbi is worth 6.75 renminbi to the dollar, or whatever it is, when it's really about 12 to the dollar, meaning that the currency is worth half of what what they're doing basically is making another item more expensive relative to the renminbi. And so that then is bumping up. In effect, they're making companies overpay. We've had a whole discussion recently on TV, and I'm sure most people turn it off because it's a financial discussion relative to international trade. And there's nothing more dry than international trade and how it works and the whole process. But it is complicated, and it's not easy to explain to people because of all of the things that are going on. From a U.S.-based standpoint, we see it as tariffs because that's the only way we control. We don't do subsidies to companies generally. We don't do subsidies to the workers. We don't control the assets of the company. We don't control their profits. We don't control the investors' profits. We don't have direct control over all of those pieces. We don't even control our currency, which trades on the open exchanges. So we have no control over any of the things that you would use to control the transfer of goods and services internally or externally to other countries, other than a tax, tariff. And so we hear people yelling about how when the U.S. creates a tariff, that they're artificially, that they're going to create a trade war, and that and it's going to result in this whole big mess of retaliation and everything else. Well, that is true. I mean, and you get the free traders that are saying we shouldn't have any of these tariffs. The market should control. And that's the problem I have with many free enterprise type people, and I am one of those, is that if somebody is controlling a portion of the market, you don't have free enterprise. There is no free trade with China. It doesn't exist. There is no free trade with Russia. It doesn't exist. Those countries do not allow free trade. They pretend, they have a facade that the general public may think is free trade, but it absolutely is not, because of what goes on in those countries, what actually happens, who can have the jobs, who can make the money, what the government does with the profits, how it's allocated, how it's spent, what the value of their currency is, how often that currency moves or trades, and whether it can be exchanged for other currencies and other goods and services. They control all of that. They control it through direct subsidies. They control it through job allocation. I mean, it's as basic as the fact that if I want to go to work in the steel industry, I don't necessarily have that choice unless the government says, yes, we'll let you go there, and as a result of that, we'll pay you, we'll allocate Chinese resources to you over somebody else who's a farmer, because we want to encourage people to work in that industry. But that's a subsidy. That's taking money from somebody else, the farmers, and giving it to that worker to overpay them so that they'll continue to work in that industry while the price of the product doesn't have to go up, while they keep the price down. So to say that there's free trade with China or Russia is ludicrous. There is no free trade. So tariffs don't cause anything that's not already happening. We're frankly at war already economically, and have been for years been at war with China and Russia. But frankly, we've been at war economically with Japan and Germany I would have said France, but we beat the heck out of them. So, there's the only thing we want from them anymore is bagels. So it's, we're already at war with these places. And to not recognize that there are two types of war. There's the wars that are waged, with men's and women's lives, and then there's the wars that are waged with men's and women's lives in terms of their livelihood. And we're at war all the time in both of those things. And it's crazy to not recognize that. It's interesting that, and again, this is not an economic, this is not a political plug. It's just an economic discussion of why someone may favor tariffs in certain industries, because there are two sides to that. One, there's the economic side to that. If our balance of trade with a particular country becomes too large, then we're at risk, because we're borrowing money from that country. They control our currency. In a free market environment, they control our currency. They either control it because they own it, or they control it because they bought our bonds. Everybody knows that one of the big concerns we had, and still do have, is that during our Great Depression that we had recently, that the Chinese would pull out from buying our debt. Even now, we're held hostage. We're held hostage by foreign countries, particularly China, because they are our creditors and they can call our loan. They can foreclose on us. That's the thing. Can you imagine if China foreclosed on their bonds? What would they do? I mean, they basically would take over the country, I guess. I mean, you could take over the country economically. You don't have to take it over by sending troops. China does not have to put a single troop on U.S. soil. They do not have to send they don't have to shoot any missiles. They don't have to put any ships offshore. All they have to do is basically force us into bankruptcy. People, think about it. Many people have individually gone through that. They've gone through bankruptcy. They've been on the brink of bankruptcy. They know what it's like to have, all of that cut off. If you can't borrow any money, we can't function. It's if there's no currency, you can't function. So if the U.S. dollar becomes so worthless that basically it no longer has meaning, we're bankrupt, and whoever has the control of the financial strings at that point really controls the country. So there's a couple different ways to be at war, and trade is an issue that has to be addressed. Now, if you're out there placing tariffs on things that are regularly trading in a free market system, yes, that's not a good thing. That's just fixing price, and ultimately something will happen. Countries will retaliate. Things will take place that will be more overt. But right now, keep in mind, I didn't say that we were just at economic war with China or with Russia. I said we're at economic war with Japan, with Germany. Those are, and to some degree England. We're at war with those countries financially. It's interesting that many years ago here in Stuart, back in the late 80s, I think it was, or mid 80s, we actually had it was eliminated. It was started during the Reagan administration. It was eliminated during the Bush Senior during his term. But what we had was in Stuart. They were functioning in Stuart with boots on the ground overseas, and headquartered ultimately out of D.C. We had an economic espionage group that was part of the Department of Defense. It had nothing to do with anything economically. It reported through to the Department of Defense. It was a defense agency. It was controlled by a very, very smart guy, young guy, out of D.C., and he was the guy that was in charge of it. And here locally, we had a guy that was coordinating the activity. And then we had another guy who used to work for the military who was running the equivalent of the CIA economically. He had economic spies overseas, a network of economic spies overseas that he was that were infiltrating foreign companies to identify and potentially control the technologies, the transfer of technologies, to make sure that U.S. technologies were not being stolen and used internationally by other countries, and also to potentially steal their technologies. And that's what we were doing, because the Reagan administration realized that you could have two kinds of war, and you had to win both of them. There was the whole military strength thing that we went through during the Reagan administration, and trust but verify and all of that. But what very few people realized is that he had implemented the same policy on the economic side. He had done the same thing economically to make sure that Russia and China and Germany and Japan were not cleaning our clock, and we're not going to wage economic war on us, which would result in us failing as a country. And I think he was a smart guy, because he recognized that is exactly what happened in Russia. It was not military strength that brought down Russia ultimately. It was economic weakness. Russia collapsed because of the inability to provide just everyday resources to its populace. And they eventually revolted and said, this doesn't work. And that's what happened. Now, the fact that we had military strength, so that their first reaction was, if I can't get it back legitimately, I'm going to go back and take it back with force. We were able to recognize and put that in place. It was amazing that that his administration recognized that and was smart enough to see that there was a war being waged on both sides. For a number of years now, we have been losing that economic war because we've chosen not to fight it, and we've thought that we were not involved in it because we weren't keeping track of what was happening. Those guys that were here in Stewart. It's interesting. George H.W. Bush eliminated that program. He got out of it. He felt like it wasn't necessary. And so he eliminated it. It actually went into the private sector. The guy that was in D.C. came here to Stewart. He opened up an office, joined up with the guy that was here who was the surveillance guy, or the internet guy, the surveillance guy from a computer technology standpoint, and hooked up with the guy that was coordinating the boots on the ground. That operation went private here in Stewart. This is where it was located, and it was an interesting thing. Back then, they had a difficult time selling the concept because people just didn't think they didn't believe them. But I'll tell you just a little example of what happened, and you can see now. This is in the 80s, so. What this company did is they had gone and met with Kodak, and they met with Kodak, and they went into them and proposed that they would tell them where they were at economic risk, where they were at risk technology-wise, what aspects of their company they didn't have control of that were key aspects of their company that could cause them to either go out of business or lose market share. And the engineers at Kodak proceeded to tell them that they were crazy, that they knew everything there was to know about that, and there was nothing that these guys could tell them, and that they were and there was no way they were paying them $250,000 to tell them what they already knew. So, so the company said, okay. So they said, tell you what, we'll go in and do this for free and just show you what to do. Because they were, as a marketing tool, they were trying to get their name out there, and Kodak was a big company at the time. So they went out there, and they identified, I think it was 17 key technologies that Kodak owned. These are, or that Kodak thought they owned. And they were technologies that they had licensing agreements on and had control of through various entities and subsidiaries and unrelated companies. But so there was like 17 of them. And after they were done, this group showed Kodak that 15 of those were owned by Fujitsu, the company that now has cleaned their clock. And the reason that they're now out of business. Of course, Kodak denied, said that you're crazy, that's wrong, we've got control over this. And fast forward 30 years, and Kodak is out of business, and all of those technologies are owned or controlled now by Fujitsu. Now, see, so that's the kind of thing. There's a company, on a small scale, there's a company in the private sector that had war waged on it by a Japanese company, with potentially Japanese support and Japanese subsidies at the time, that ultimately put that company out of business. Same as if somebody had gone in and taken it over in a hostile takeover with guns and anything else. That, Kodak no longer has the strength that it has because it lost all of its technology. Any of the strides that it was making were being taken using the base technology that they had developed, but now was being stolen by an international company. The same thing is happening in the world right now from an economic standpoint among countries. Countries are and we're in the midst of it. All we've done now is just indicate that whichever way you want to look at it, we've either declared war or, frankly, as I just said, all we've done is recognize we were already in one. It's like somebody just getting ready to hit the beach in Normandy and saying, well, maybe we're in a war. Well, yeah, you were already in one. That's why you were on the ship to start with, and that's what's going on with the economic war. We have been in it. In certain industries, we have been in it for a long time, and we have been losing it because we are not subsidizing it to the extent that other countries are. And from a defense standpoint, if you think about it, we have to economically defend our currency. We have to economically defend our economy, because if we don't, we go broke and somebody takes us over. And ultimately, we also have to physically defend our country. Let's think about it for a minute. If you're in a free enterprise system, let's say you really are in a free enterprise system, on one side, and we are on the U.S., we're a capitalistic system. Our investors are looking for a good return. If they are not getting an adequate return out of selling steel and investing in a company that makes steel in the U.S., and that's being subsidized by the Chinese so that there's no way we can make a fair profit, there never will be a fair price paid, because the competition is a communistic country that is subsidizing jobs and prices. Then what happens on our side of the equation? Well, on our side of the equation, we abandon that industry. We abandon that product. So if we can't make money at steel because we're not subsidizing it or protecting it through tariffs or whatever else, we won't have any steel plants left in the U.S. because there's no reason to. You can't get any money. Nobody wants to put money in something they're going to lose money on. So why would you do that in a free enterprise system? And if the government doesn't make you, now if the government could come in and say you have to invest in steel, you have to buy steel as an investor, every single portfolio in the U.S., every retirement portfolio has to have 10% steel. Okay, then I got no choice, and I guess I'm buying steel. And I just have to hope the rest of my companies do better. But that's not what happens in the U.S. They're not going to control you. That you don't have to have U.S. steel in your portfolio at all. You can get rid of it. You don't care. So you're done. You're gone. You sell out. You bought Apple. You're out of steel. And now there's nobody in the U.S. making steel any longer or aluminum. So we go to war. Who's going to build this stuff? We're going to buy it from China? We're going to buy it from Russia? Well, if you're at war with them, it's going to be pretty hard. They're probably not going to sell it to you. And their companies aren't going to have a choice because they're owned by the government. So think about that a minute. Isn't there a defense aspect of some trade? I mean, don't you have to make sure that you always have some industry in the U.S. that is subsidized because it's necessary if you're at war? I mean, when you look at it from an economic standpoint, you have to subsidize certain activities for national defense. You have to subsidize steel and aluminum, or unless we come up with a better product that replaces that. But you have to subsidize the industries that are a basis of war. You have to subsidize the Lockheeds and the Boeings, because if they aren't here, if they're all Airbuses, how do we get planes if we need to fight? You're going to take a couple years to build some plants? Yeah, we could do it. We have the technology. But what happens in the interim? We say to the other country, wait, time out. This is like when I was a kid and we used to play war. You had to go to the bathroom. Time out. Hold it up. I'm going to put my gun down now. I got to go. I'll be right back. Well, no, you can't do that. When you declared war or you've had war declared on you, you can't say, time out. We need to build our infrastructure back up again. It'll take us 3 to 5 years. Give us 3 to 5 years, and we guarantee we'll give you a good war. But in the interim, we can't. So just hold off a minute, would you? You can't do that. So there is some, no matter what we say, I mean, and my personal opinion, the one and only basic thing that the government is supposed to do, that the federal government is supposed to do, as opposed to the state governments, as opposed to the local governments, is protect us, in case of war. That's what they're supposed to do. We're supposed to have a military. That's the reason that that it's there, really. And so if we can't have one because we haven't allowed for industry that can help us if we need to go to war, then we lose. And then the government didn't do their job. So the only reason that government really should have any ability to control economic prices and economic taxes and tariffs is to support the war machine. I mean, that's it, frankly, because if we're unprotected economically, we're unprotected physically. So they have a responsibility to, and that includes food. You wonder why certain industries are subsidized, and we get ticked off because some of those industries don't, they don't produce. They genetically change stuff, and it causes all kinds of issues. And I understand that, and we wish those people would go out of business. And we wonder why the government subsidizes it. Well, frankly, the reason the government subsidizes it is if we stop growing stuff. Listen, I grew up in the Midwest. Farming is a lousy occupation. It is. You cannot make money at it unless it's subsidized. You cannot. You can have large corporations. Individually, you can't. You can have large corporations that potentially, but because of weather, because of other issues, flooding and all kinds of things that you don't have control of, you cannot guarantee that you can stay alive in the farming business. It's just impossible. In a free enterprise system, we would say let them go away. What we have done instead is we've allowed them to consolidate. Now, as soon as they consolidate, we don't have free enterprise, so they got to be regulated, right? So every agricultural business, the major businesses need to be regulated, because otherwise they're just going to, the price that the individual farmer gives is not going to be a fair price because it's controlled by major companies. So it has to be a regulated industry, but the industry has to exist. We couldn't just let it go away, because if we let it go away, what do we do? If it doesn't happen and it isn't there, how do we feed people if we're at war? We have to feed people. You have to eat. You have to have guns, and you have to eat if you're going to fight. Those are a couple things that you have to have. And so, it's also the reason why we have to have, right now, we have to have some fossil fuels. There are certain industries that have to be protected economically because they're part of the defense industry, not because they're part of the economic world. It's because they're part of the defense industry. And until we recognize that what we're doing has both a economic and a defense rationale, then we're not fully understanding why certain things are happening. But it's a cause and effect. If you think about that for a minute, it's a cause and effect. Now, you can use that same rationalization for saving the financial industry, for saving the banks. Well, yeah, currency is important, and the ability to move currency is important, but the individual banks are not as important to that as the central bank is, the Federal Reserve. So, we probably need to preserve our Federal Reserve System and our federal banking system to make sure that it's stable from a Federal Reserve standpoint. But anyway, it's an interesting discussion that's taking place right now. Unfortunately, it's being turned into a political discussion, not really a discussion of why. There's been very little discussion of what some of the rationale is and why it does make a difference who you're providing tariffs on, or what products you're providing tariffs on. If you're doing tariffs in certain clothing, or if you're doing it in certain products, then it's that are purely economic products, luxury products, those type of things, or products that there are significant amounts of, just to create jobs in that industry. That's not right, because now we're allocating resources to an industry that doesn't necessarily need that protection. But on the other hand, if we're preserving a certain number of jobs in the auto industry or in the heavy equipment industry or something like that we're using to make sure that we have the ability to wage war, then I'm not so sure that that's not is a bad idea. Anyway, so think about some of this talk that's taking place from that standpoint. Think about it from an economic standpoint, and think about the fact that we are already at economic war, and who we're at war with. And it may surprise you. It's not always not who we think. It's not always the regular enemies, so to speak. And there is war being waged constantly against the U.S. on the economic front. And I think the government does have some responsibility to at least monitor and protect that and make sure that it doesn't cause us to be at war physically. So anyway, that's kind of the discussion this morning. Hopefully it gives you something to think about. Join us again next Wednesday right here on WSTU Digital 1450. We're Treasure Coast Solutions, and we're here whether you like it or not.